Early in 2003, Baghdad was waiting. Baghdad was uncertain. Life went on, but everyone knew that tomorrow they'd be plunged into the unknown.
All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end.
US President George Walker Bush had taken the decision to invade Iraq. The operation would be called Iraqi Freedom. Its aim, to overthrow Saddam Hussein, absolute master of the country for 35 years. Behind the desert sands, foreign troops massed on the borders of neighboring countries. They awaited the final order to attack. Saddam Hussein was driven into a corner, caught in the net. But he stood firm. He knew his two oldest assets would now be more useful than ever: pride, everyone would see it as determination, and his dominant charisma, which would give everyone confidence. He also knew he would have to reckon with the setbacks he had caused in order to rule: suspicion, servility, and terror. A few weeks before the deployment of the American steamroller, a strange scene occurred in a windowless room in one of the secret villas to which the regime had relocated its departments to prepare the riposte to the invasion. A kind of final act in which the absurd blindness and insanity are brought out into the open. A handful of strategists, among the most submissive, presented the Rais with some of their findings, enough to do battle with the Americans. Nails, bows and arrows, and slings. Saddam Hussein observed, waited, then smiled. The previous night he had entrusted his translators with the final pages of a book he was writing, a magical tale entitled Out, Devil. A threatening phrase, but fiction nonetheless.
As we were there from September 2002, as we moved to March 2003, it became more and more clear that, in fact, we would have to probably end up going to war and probably would enter into Iraq.
I remember, I believe it was late summer, that we understood that we would have to deploy in order to take the mission to go to Iraq. It was about probably August, and there was a gate training strategy that we had to develop in order to have the soldiers train and for our platoons and our companies in order to be confident.
My brigade combat team deployed with the 101st, the rest of our division, in February of 2003. We went to Kuwait and occupied several assembly areas, camps, if you will, and my brigade was in Camp Pennsylvania.
I have a military background. I was in the Marines myself when I was a young man, so I understand certain things about being with the military. So when the Pentagon first announced that it was thinking about having bringing journalists with them, having an embedded journalism program, my editor came to me, or actually the foreign editor for the Chronicle approached me and asked me would I be interested in being part of it.
I was writing a novel at the time, but I gradually felt that this work of the imagination was turning into a series of daily articles on the approaching war, on my friends leaving Baghdad for their hometowns, and on the mindset of the youth in face of the new world awaiting them. The future was blurred. That's what frightened people most. But within that fear, there was a hope for change. People wanted this change, whatever the cost, even foreign occupation.
We were audiovisual graduates. We were posted to radio and TV station. My department numbered 2 young women, 1 older lady and 2 men. None of us felt like reporters.
In Iraq, the situation was this. The people were hungry, and the soldiers' pay was very low. They wanted everything back to normal, so that they could start living like people in the Gulf states. They believed that after Iraq was invaded, they'd live like there, in safety and in wealth, wanting for nothing.
Medium regular coat. Large regular coat. Medium regular coat.
I was renting a house, me, an officer, a colonel in the army. Was my monthly pay enough to feed the family? After 2 weeks, it had all gone. After 10 days, all gone. How do you make it to the end of the month? I'm talking about my own situation during a time when all we ate was bread and yogurt. A bit of cheese and a yogurt, that was dinner. And I was a senior officer. It was madness.
During the embargo, a soldier's pay was never above 3,000 dinars, or $3 to $4 a month. And he had to travel from one region to the next, eat, drink, sleep, and then return to the front. All these conditions made invasion easier, rather than motivate a soldier to defend his homeland.
I left the army in 2002. Since I was unqualified, I started working in the presidential palaces as part of a team installing the internal communications networks. I earned 2,500 dinars a day, just under $3, and I was paid weekly.
The average salary for members of the security services was never higher than $5 to $10 a month. Members of the security services and the army dressed like hobos. Those who gave in to stealing or corruption made out okay, but the rest lived in extreme poverty.
Initially, the 4th Division was a part of the force that was supposed to enter Iraq. It was a very powerful division. It was our most modern division at the time, and our most modern mechanized division. Vehicles were able to see through digitized computer screens where each other were.
In terms of modernizing its military equipment, Iraq was way behind. So, in case of an attack on Baghdad, we wouldn't have been able to get one plane off the ground.
The vehicle I commanded is an M1A1 main battle tank. It's a main battle tank. It's heavily armored and it's heavily armed. It's got a 120 millimeter cannon, which is a big cannon. It shoots with a muzzle velocity of a mile a second. The round coming out of the tube travels a mile a second, and there's no armor on the modern day battlefield that cannon cannot defeat. So if I can hit you, it's going to kill you.
Iraqi military equipment was a full generation behind that of the Americans. In the regiments I commanded, the most modern tanks dated from 1972. That's old enough, but we had other tanks that dated from 1955 and 1962.
There was constant training, constant activity, so much so that there was a haze over all of Kuwait that was made from all the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and boots on the ground. It just was like smog. It's just the entire sky was lit up with this bright haze.
Let's go.
It worked out very well for us because we had the entire desert to train and operate in. And so we did what all American units do. We do war games, what if kind of things, because we never knew if we did get the order to conduct the invasion, what would the objective be and how far would we go on.
In Iraq, the Ba'ath Party had two branches, one civilian and one military. As Ba'ath was the only party in government, it also controlled the army. Any citizen who worked in public or military services had to be a Ba'ath Party member. For military men, it was strict. They had to be loyal and faithful to the Ba'ath Party.
الجهاز الحزبي متوزع ضمن المناطق ضمن الرقعة الجغرافية يعني
The party apparatus controlled the whole area. We controlled every district, main streets and back alleys. We had the full responsibility of a centralized body whose leaders in the field held all sorts of powers. That way, the moment someone came into one of our sectors, they were immediately checked and questioned.
On every street corner and intersection, there was a party office on one side, a security service office on the other. And nearby, there was always a secret service office. All three of them were watching each other.
Any party bigwig could claim to have recruited 1,000 activists when he'd really only recruited a handful or none. The aim was to look good in the eyes of the leaders, but this illusion of a massive number of party members weakened the regime in the end.
They didn't stop coming to see us. We asked them what they wanted, and they said they wanted women as well as men to become Ba'ath Party members. May Allah damn them. They wanted us to turn into their supporters so we would spy on our own friends and families.
In Iraq, social relations had broken down.
اتفككت. الولد يكتب على أبوه تقارير.
Sons denounced fathers, daughters denounced mothers, and wives wrote reports denouncing their husbands. So social and family ties were completely undone, to such a point that a father could send his son off to war in the hope that he'd die a martyr, and the father would earn a bonus or be awarded damages.
We did get a lot of training about the Iraqi people, about the culture, and they told us they understand we're of a different religion, but if you're the sort of person who hides your religion, that makes you untrustable, so don't hide your religion.
We learned some language, some words, thank you, stop or I'll shoot.
We learned how to say Keith, which means stop, and shukran, which means thank you. La shukran means no thank you. Medina means city. Very few words.
If you're a combat unit and your mission is to kill and lay waste to everything in front of you. So what do you need to know about the local population? Not much. You just need to know that they're not dressed the same as you are, and you just need to know what kind of weapons they might have or what kind of problems you might run into.
One of the things I emphasize, and I'm a realist in this respect, you're not going to teach everybody how to speak Arabic, but if you pick up a few phrases, I mean, I know how to say thank you in 25 languages, and that word gets you the most mileage in just about any culture.
There was some cultural training, sensitivity training in the sense of trying to instill in the Marines that they were not there to be a conquering force. They tried to instill it very much in them that in fact what they were there to do was depose Saddam Hussein and get Saddam out of power and then leave.
Of course, the regime-controlled media only showed one side of things and never the other. Alternative media and television channels were banned. So by only ever seeing Saddam Hussein making his speeches, you ended up believing him. And before the war, this belief was at a maximum. A few months before the war, those close to the powers that be had a feeling of fear and uncertainty that we didn't pick up on. One day, as we were watching Saddam Hussein making a speech at the place of his nephew, Ayman Sabawi, Ayman suddenly started laughing. I asked him why he was laughing, especially because his uncle seemed really pessimistic. And he said, "When my uncle smiles and smokes a cigar, it means he's sure he'll win." I told him there's no proof that a smile and a cigar could bring off such a miracle.
People were worn out. When rumors spread of the end of Saddam's regime, we were dumbfounded. But when he appeared on TV to make his speeches, we all thought he was nuts, that he'd lost his mind. He carried on as if he held the whole Arab world in his hand. On June 30th, 2002, in a meeting with Saddam, I asked if we could talk about the possible forthcoming war with the U.S. I illustrated the gap between us, including the Republican Guard, our so-called crack troops, and the American and Allied forces.
None of us doubted we could defeat Saddam's army. Our army had defeated them once before in the first Gulf War. We knew that they were going to be beaten, and severely. The question became, what then?
As war seemed inevitable,
العراقية من تفادي الحرب.
I suggested to the president that we reorganize our army
بحيث نغير عقيدتنا إلى حرب العصابات أي
and the way we did battle in order to mount guerrilla warfare.
نوع من أنواع القتال وهو الحرب الغير نظامي أي حرب العصابات.
After the meeting, while we were posing for the official photo, the president gave a mocking smile and said, "Are you trying to scare us, General?"
تحاول أن تخيفنا يا جنرال.
وكل العراقيين حاضرين لملاقاة الأعداء. والله ينصرك سيدي ويحفظك.
ويحفظكم إن شاء الله ويحفظ الشعب.
نحن كنا جنود فالجندي يتلقى مع أوامر.
We were just simple soldiers,
من القيادات.
following our superiors' orders.
من خلال المعلومات اللي تجينا من خلال ضباط.
The officers told us we had the necessary strength and morale to resist.
القوة الكافية وعندنا الاستعداد النفسي
We were really motivated.
نقاوم هيك فكانت اكو حوافز.
We believed we could fight and win the war.
نقدر نقاوم ونقدر يعني احتمال
At that moment,
ننتصر بالحرب.
our whole future was at stake.
تهديد تقرير مصير.
احنا صرخة الحياة ما تهزنا العاصفات حدينا صدام
وموزع الأدوار.
Roles were clearly handed out. Military leaders were dispatched to the different regions of Iraq. But these leaders refused to obey the orders of the political leaders. And contrary to what was said, the political leaders didn't make decisions for the military leaders.
In the context of preparing for war, the room for maneuver of the military command was considerably reduced due to the power of the politicians.
The opposite is true. The political leaders were spread over 3 regions: the south, center, and the north were placed under the leadership of military leaders because it was a military conflict.
All Iraqi army leaders knew that Saddam had formed 3 main regional military axes, one in the north, one in the center, and one in the south. To lead them, he appointed non-military men: Al-Hussein al-Majid, Qusay Saddam Hussein, and Izzat al-Duri.
Ali Hassan al-Majid, alias Chemical Ali, was the man who did Saddam's dirty work, the bloodthirsty liquidator, among other exploits, of the Kurds. Qusay Saddam Hussein was naturally primed to take over from his father. As for Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri, he had always been Saddam's right-hand man in politics. Later, the king of clubs would be one of the few to escape the clutches of the Americans and secretly carry on his political career among the ranks of the insurgents.
None of them had any link with the military or any idea of Iraqi's military history. It created an unspeakable mess and a general feeling of anxiety.
But how much longer before we as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough? Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax.
I remember in Kuwait, we're in the big tent with my soldiers, and there's a TV there. And Colin Powell was giving his speech up at the UN. And I'm sitting there watching him intently. And just sort of out loud, I said, this guy doesn't believe what he's saying. And a couple of my officers turned to me and said, sir, what are you talking about?
You know, you're sitting out there, you have the not just the 1st Marine Division out in the Kuwaiti desert. You have half of the U.S. Army, you have Air Force, Navy. Everybody's out there, and you're thinking sometimes it's just like that the avalanche that started, and it's like, how do you stop it? You kind of don't.
We opened up a Pandora's box out there, and we weren't really prepared to deal with the whole consequence of that.
Iraq was living in a bubble, totally cut off. Back then, we had no cell phones or satellite TV. Iraqis could watch only state-run channels, the only ones allowed.
Same for the press. There were only 5 newspapers, and all of them told the same story. The only difference between them was the font they used for their headlines.
All news in Iraq was coated in lead. There were no satellite channels, but we listened to the French radio station RMC. All Iraqis listened to that or to the BBC World Service. They heard the voices of the opposition in exile and the appeals they launched. We knew the war was lost in advance. 100% lost.
The TV technicians refitted the basement studios, which had been deserted, and they started working in an experimental way. The anchormen came down and started broadcasting from there. We had a sense of urgency, but no one told us anything officially.
I believe the final count in Kuwait was, at the time the war kicked off, I want to say there were 750 journalists. That's a lot of reporters, photographers, producers of every type. That's a lot of people out on the battlefield. That's almost an entire battalion right there.
محافظة التأميم التقينا بشعبة الواسطي من أبناء حزبنا العقائدي حزب البعث العربي الاشتراكي. الله يساعدهم شباب. شلون المعنويات؟
الحمد لله المعنويات عالية.
We did reports on people who had come from Jordan, Syria, and Palestine. Lots of youngsters arrived to enlist in an organization called the Fedayeen of Saddam. They weren't called the Fedayeen of Iraq, but the Fedayeen of Saddam. They were trained by the Ba'ath Party bigwigs, trained to blow themselves up, to fight, and to handle weapons. These guys were dispatched throughout the country. We poked fun at ourselves. We knew there was a national defense plan, but in the case of an American chemical attack or aerial bombardments, our training would prove useless. Would we have time to take cover? We were in a ridiculous situation, but we had to obey. We were unusually worried. The officers knew we could be defeated in a single day.
All the efforts were focused on protecting Ba'ath Party and government buildings, and on nothing else. Normal citizens had to fend for themselves, to feed their families, and protect their friends and loved ones.
For us to stock up, especially as we Iraqis love to eat, the authorities handed out rations every 2 months. We were ready for anything, even a chemical attack. We sealed the windows with nylon, and we were ready. But we were scared of not knowing the outcome and of not knowing what lay in store.
Intercepted communications indicate one division southeast of Baghdad is about to be issued chemical weapons to be used against the invaders.
When we were still in Kuwait, like in the days leading up to the invasion, we were constantly told Saddam has chemical weapons, for sure, and he will use them. But it was all very scary stuff because, you know, they were giving us these syringes and telling us that we had to inject our thighs to counteract the gas or we would die.
At the time, I felt like a camera, moving from one place to another. I was observing what people were going through. There was kind of a never-ending wait. The regime was preparing for war, while the people were going about their daily business. They went to the pool, watched TV, read books. They saw themselves as extras in a drama. The drama had begun, but they weren't really part of it.
Saddam called a big meeting on the first day of 2003. His vision of things had become metaphysical and religious. He came out with something that made me shiver and chilled me to the bone. He said, I know the Iraqi army is weak, very weak compared to the American army. But Allah has no other army than ours. A holy miracle will happen. The Americans will reach the gates of Baghdad, and we will beat them. And when you return victorious from this battle, I will tell you, now go west. Free Jerusalem from the Israelis and put the Palestinians back on their land. To my mind, this was the closing speech of the Iraqi movie.
A week before the war, Saddam stopped appearing on TV to give his speeches. We'd receive a sound recording, which we listened to, transcribed and read out on air. The anchor had to read out about 60 or 70 pages during the broadcast. Sometimes we ran late, and the proofreader had to sit at the anchor's feet, handing him the pages one by one. It made us suspicious. There were two possibilities. Either Saddam looked too weak to appear on screen, or he had left Baghdad.
From Saddam's perspective, he saw, threats, regular threats to him, and there were regular threats to him. He was quite correct. So he tended to withdraw. He tended to trust people even less. He tended to not trust those who came from outside of his family or tribe. He tended not to trust those whom he didn't control directly.
In Saddam Hussein's inner circle were his two sons. One of them, Uday, a rather disturbing figure, openly displayed his image as a lover of big cats. Everything was set up for him to show off his pathological power and ferocity. Uday was as unreliable as he was unpredictable. When war was announced, his father put him in charge of the militia, which suited his nature, the Fedayeen of Saddam. The other son, Qusay, had learned from his father that absolute power could only last if it was carried out in cold blood. Saddam Hussein had made him supreme head of his elite army, the Republican Guard, and of his secret service. He saw Qusay alone as his successor. In the war preparations, the heir of the Rais, despite his lack of military experience, became a main decision-maker.
The Minister of Defense was only there for show. He was nothing compared to Qusay. Qusay had the first and last word.
We had a very dangerous role as a kind of family screen around Hussein. It meant acting as his eyes and ears, and bringing him messages from the outside or concealing things from him. We either told him what he wanted to hear or hid what he didn't want to hear.
One of the key individuals for Saddam throughout the 1990s and up to the war was his presidential secretary, a guy by the name of Abed Hamoud.
Abed Hamoud ran all the security departments in Saddam's name, except for the special secret service run by Qusay, at his father's request. Abed Hamoud shut off all communication routes to Saddam.
This was a guy who went in to see Saddam, he knew what Saddam decided, and he knew what came out of Saddam's office. He knew as much about Iraq and the regime as anyone other than Saddam. He knew more even than the sons.
Abed Hamoud was the only man allowed to carry a gun in Saddam's presence. Always at his side, he was everywhere, filtering everything, keeping an eye on everything. Later, when the American offensive started, he would prove particularly useful and loyal by stashing Saddam's money and weapons. A few weeks before the outbreak of war, he met with several leaders of the Republican Guard who wanted to inform Saddam of the true state of the army. Abed Hamoud told them this: "If I give you the privilege of addressing Saddam, you will have two obligations: to be resolutely optimistic and to satisfy him with what you say." Saddam saw the officers and spoke with them. They said nothing and applauded him at the end.
We managed to catch Bush's speech with our satellite dishes. That was the only way we could hear it.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours.
That's when we knew something serious was about to happen.
In fact, our vision of Iraq and its army was wrong. We had no real idea of how bad the shortages were due to the embargo. Iraq had been bled dry. It was an empty shell. One blow from the outside, and it would collapse. We had never imagined that.
They took up position in every street in the capital, which became one big army base. The Ba'ath Party dug trenches and set up walls of sandbags in the streets. They were trying to fool everyone into thinking the regime could hold out, that they were in control of the situation and that the Americans would enter neither Iraq nor Baghdad. There were also smoke clouds, which, according to Saddam, would prevent the Americans from targeting the regime's positions. A few days before the fighting started, the U.S. Air Force dropped pamphlets calling for the Iraqi people to rise up against Saddam. A lot of regions were showered with pamphlets, a tactic that escaped the control of Saddam's security forces.
In Amara, we received pamphlets urging us to desert or face destruction. They said that we were defending injustice and that they were defending justice.
We only really understood when Ba'ath Party members started going door to door, district by district, handing out weapons.
We couldn't advance, we couldn't retreat. We were mere pawns.
The Minister of Defense lost control of the troops. Army headquarters had no further role in running operations.
It was late winter. We couldn't watch weather forecasts on TV. It was the time of the Taraya, the time of sandstorms. The mood was one of great sadness. At that point, I realized it was the moment of truth, the final battle. Baghdad was deserted. The only sound was silence. We had the feeling the whole city belonged to us. But while we were acutely aware of what the city meant to us, we knew this feeling would disappear. Everything was cloaked in silence. One of my friends said, "The city has gone mute," and another one answered him, "If the city has stopped talking, it means it's dead. This city is already dead."
On March 19th, 2003, at dawn, we were informed that the air traffic control radars had picked up more than 20 planes in Iraqi airspace to the south. These planes had flown within 180 kilometers of Baghdad before turning round and heading back south. But on the second day, the so-called shock and awe offensive truly began, and Baghdad was bombed with incredible intensity.
The explosion started before dawn. They were really loud. But I wasn't scared. I watched the show with the planes and the anti-aircraft fire through the window. It was like a big firework display. But the detonations were terrifying.
The air bombardment started with cruise missiles. Then the US Air Force filled the Iraqi skies. I was at home. When I heard the attack, I quickly put on my army uniform. The Minister of Defense had relocated 6 HQs around Baghdad.
People started packing up their belongings. I saw them in my neighborhood carrying blankets, furniture, supplies, flour. They were loading up their cars and waiting for daybreak before leaving. It was a dramatic image that reminded me of piling up corpses to take them to a mass grave. At that moment, it was as if Baghdad had disappeared.
I arrived at the assembly point. The minister was already there, along with all his officers.
With their experience of the 1990 Gulf War, American planes knew how to target our anti-aircraft defenses. The fact that these had been positioned in residential areas gave citizens all the more reason to flee the city.
My neighborhood was bombed. I remember telling my family I wouldn't leave the house because I wanted to watch what was happening. As they left, my family was furious because they thought the war would destroy everything, the buildings and their inhabitants.
From the Kuwaiti border, 500 armored vehicles and 170,000 troops would now be unleashed on Iraq. Among them, the 3rd Battalion of the 4th Marines Regiment, led by Colonel Brian McCoy, a war leader looked up to by his men. McCoy was a Cuban cigar lover with a bizarre ritual. Before every battle, he would whistle the well-known Brazilian tune, The Girl from Ipanema. The radio code name he chose for himself was Dark Side, a nod to the Star Wars movies. That morning, McCoy, whose mission was to advance on the capital, was still unaware that due to a statue on Paradise Square, he would become the man who conquered Baghdad.
We're seeing some rocket flashes from the left here. That's what, west. This camera is facing north. We're not really sure what it is. We might have thought it was gas. We donned our masks, and then we were told to cease and desist. Everything was all clear. I'm speaking during this video for documentation purposes.
It was very dark. It was very scary up there because it was just sand, and you kind of didn't even know where the border was. We kept moving around and changing position, waiting for the final announcement that the invasion was launched. And what I did to start with was I was in the Humvee with Colonel McCoy at the beginning of all this, at the time hoping that I would be able to see enough combat that was going on, but he was a well-protected guy, so saved my life.
I think one of the sort of defining thoughts as we went across the Burma into Iraq with myself and most soldiers, and that was sort of all of the unknowns.
I was following, with military high command and the secret services, the battle that had started in the south. There were undeniable signs of a mass offensive. Among them, openings made in the wall of sand separating Kuwait and Iraq.
We crossed at a place called Safwan. The two governments there dug a big ditch and put a big Burma to distinguish where the international border lies. We're up front, so we're going to be one of the first ones going, but you're waiting for your turn. So you wait, you wait, you wait. But when your time comes, you charge through there because it's a choke point. You got to get through there very fast. You got to keep keep it clear so that units can just keep pushing as rapidly as we can, and we're not bottled up there, which would be a good place for the enemy to attack.
Finally made it, man. Where are we? Just crossed the border to Iraq about 10 miles ago. Destination, north.
At around 4 p.m., the first clashes started in Naziriyah and in Basra, where there was a regiment to protect the oil fields, as there was in Qusay.
We have a lot of units coming their way, and the first one I engaged, it was a T-54 tank, and exploded. It was not very dramatic or anything like that. It just was pretty much the way we had been trained to do it. Acquired him, engaged him, shot him, killed him.
I was at home when the war started. We joined up with our army units following the Rais's speech. We had already dug personal trenches. We handed out wages, equipment, and munitions in the trenches. The tanks took up position, but that night was hell for us.
When the war started, I was on the Saudi border, in the al-Hashu region. We were attacked during the night by helicopters. We were in a state of total confusion. It was the first war we'd ever been in. We'd only just joined the army after graduating from college. We were a forward observation unit. There were 3 of us, 2 officers and 1 soldier. All we had was 1 Kalashnikov each. I was in charge of 2 Strela missiles, but I couldn't even get out and launch them due to the bad situation we were in.
On the first day, the U.S. Air Force was cautious. But this caution gradually disappeared, and planes started swooping down above our trenches. They were having fun. They're terrible memories, absolutely terrifying. Every night lasted an eternity. The bombings were non-stop. At sunup, you discover a tank blown up here, a dead body there, the quartermaster burned to cinders. One night, the Americans bombed the supplies store not far from my position. I woke up and all I could see were flames. In the morning, I saw that the gasoline stocks and tankers had all burned. My face was black and deformed from the soot that had spread everywhere during the night.
When I entered Iraq, it was like what you can imagine of what you see on television about Iraq. The flat desert, the white sands, the tents, the Bedouins, and the areas associated with that. But as we got closer to Baghdad, it sort of became not necessarily a paradise, but there was a lot of trees and a lot of vegetation.
We were in our attack formations going across this sparsely populated area in western Iraq, and you would come upon these Bedouin tribes that by nature they move around the desert with their animals from grazing area to grazing area. And so you literally had almost two eras of times in history come in contact with each other. Bedouins kind of look up and just wondering, like, who are these people on these tanks? And ours are sort of driving by. They seem to be very friendly people. They're waving and exchanging pleasantries and all that. So it was kind of a surreal moment.
If you can imagine, you have an alien in your local community. I mean, we don't want to be there, consistently throughout the years. We want to be able to transition into a stable government and to help the Iraqi people. And I think that's what they were looking for.
There did start to be the use of the term Haji. Haji is an Arab term that refers to somebody who has gone on the Hajj to Mecca, which you're supposed to do at some time in your life if you're Muslim. But nobody wanted to make it like ugly or pejorative. Once you're in a combat zone and there's fighting and you watch your friend die at the hands of somebody who looks like that or who acts like that, speaks like that, then Haji becomes like, then it's no longer, hey, that Haji was here. Now it's like, well, fucking Haji.
I tried to think rationally, but I could see in this war some mysterious dimension. Due to the all-technological power that could reduce everything to a mirage. I kept questioning myself. Ethically, can I be for a war that will result in regime change? Or should I be against it because I'm a writer and I don't believe in resorting to violence?
At daybreak, I was supposed to go to work. My father wanted to leave the house and go somewhere safer, outside the capital. He thought the war was only to get Saddam Hussein. But to reach him, Baghdad would have to burn like in previous wars. My mother had a more religious view. If it's written that we shall die, then we shall die. If it's written that we shall live, then we shall live. I felt uneasy about both my father's view and my mother's view. Baghdad wasn't its bridges and buildings, it was us, our neighbours and our friends. I insisted on going to work, but my mother and father refused. Despite that, a car came for me at 10 o'clock and I left. I cried. I was so sad. I crossed the bridge of the Republic and I saw government headquarters and the ministries in flames. The radio was broadcasting a speech by Saddam in a form of poetry. Stay and resist. The war has begun.
ولكنني أقول
على كل واحد منا في عائلة العراق المؤمنة الصابرة المظلومة من أعدائها الأشرار أن يتذكر.
Either we're almost there or we're not even close.
It was mostly desert as we were out to the west of the main highway, avoiding the cities. Of course, 3rd Infantry Division on the west side of the Euphrates River, and the Marines were on the east side of the river, had already moved up.
We killed a lot of Iraqis on the first day, and it's very easy for us to defeat them. And we pulled into our position at first night, and I spoke to my gunner, Marine named Corporal Schroeder. And I said, almost doesn't even seem fair, does it? He said, no, Staff Sergeant. I said, well, you just keep pulling the trigger. You don't worry about that. You'll figure out how to live with it later, but you just keep pulling that trigger.
McCoy just said this to the Marines. He said, keep your honor clean. Remember that. You don't want to get back to the United States. You don't want to get done with this and feel like you've sullied yourself or dirtied yourself. Like, don't do the wrong. Do the right thing. Always do the right thing. Keep your honor clean. Fight with a happy heart. And let's go do our nation's business.
كانت الدبابات أمام أعيننا في أول يوم تضرب بالطائرات.
Right on day one, our tanks were destroyed by American planes, like at a turkey shoot.
ولذلك هذه مشاعرنا باتجاه.
The battle was lost in advance. We just wondered when it would be over, where it would happen, what limits they would set themselves, what the fate of the Iraqi people would be, and what would happen to our mothers and children. Those were the things we were worried about.
A few tanks made it to Dibiasat, but once there, they were bombed. From then on, our unit broke up. The senior officer fled, along with all the other officers. It felt like a tree had come down on me.
We clearly weren't looking for major battles. We were looking for possibilities of launching small attacks on them.
Over this rise came a number of pickup trucks. I said really kind of civilian pickup trucks, but they had machine guns mounted on the back, and then they had fighters in the back with RPG, rocket launchers, and things like that. And they started engaging our tanks. It was clear that these white pickup trucks were not friendly vehicles, and in fact were what were going to become one of the major enemy elements.
When I used to write poems questioning the regime, I would disguise it to protect myself in case it fell into the authorities' hands. Then, for the very first time, I felt the regime had reached its end. For the very first time, I could write freely with my hand and reread with the expectant eyes of someone awaiting that end.
Most of those close to Saddam left to take refuge in places far away from where they had been posted. Many of the bigwigs in the regime left their governorates to go back to their hometowns.
Basically, the highest placed Ba'ath Party members fled the battleground and sought refuge outside Iraq. They hadn't planned anything for after the war.
بذات الوقت يوم 21 دفع رتل من اتجاه طريق الناصري. هذا الآن الرتل اندفع وفرز انقسم قسمين. قسم توجه باتجاه سوق الشيوخ وأيضا اصطدم بالقطاعات الموجودة عندنا هناك واصطدم بالعشائر والحزب وتوقف. يصير عليه اللواء مع هذه المكان.
During the first days of the war, there was a famous press conference given by the Minister of Defense, Sultan Hashem, the only professional soldier on the defense team. The army chief, Sultan Hashem, had predicted that the Americans would be inside Baghdad within 2 weeks, which is what happened just after this press conference. It was practically an order for the army to lay down its weapons, because if the defense minister was so sure of the outcome, what was the point in fighting?
We took advantage of a unique opportunity when an endless 3-day sandstorm blew up during the night of March 25th to 26th.
Just kept building stronger, and we were all afraid because it was like, well, okay, we're just gonna sit here and wait this sandstorm out, but like, what if the Iraqis are gonna use this? This is their territory. They could just come and attack us.
Baghdad was like a graveyard. For the most part, the men were in the trenches. Anyone who knows Baghdad will tell you that it was no longer Baghdad, which is usually all hustle and bustle. Baghdad was like a tomb.
Wednesday, April the 2nd, 2003. American forces were very close to Baghdad. Their priority objective was the airport. This mission was entrusted to Colonel Rutter, a formidable officer who, after a period spent in armored vehicles in the desert, greatly appreciated the green landscapes of Baghdad. The airport was defended by the regime's elite corps, the Republican Guard, led by Saddam's son, Qusay. Here unfolded the only true battle of this war. Meanwhile, Dr. Hanan Hamid had only one thing in mind: to save her husband from Abu Ghraib prison, where he had been jailed, along with many others, on trumped-up charges shortly before the war. So she bit the bullet and headed to the airport to find Qusay, the only person who could pardon her husband.
The night of April 2nd, we were on the outskirts of the airport in order to negotiate various rivers and dikes and bridges. Once we arrived, it was that quiet lull before you knew that something was about to happen. We realized that, that it wasn't going to be that easy and just walking into a specific airport.
On April the 3rd, I left between 8 and 9 o'clock. The streets were deserted, apart from the columns of military vehicles tearing along towards Abu Ghraib and the airport. Right in front of me, I saw 2 or 3 explosions, one of which hit 2 red buses transporting volunteers of the Al-Qaeda army. The road leading to the airport was definitely being targeted by the strikes. I stopped the car and jumped out. There were no flames or smoke, Just a kind of white mist, like a dazzling flash of lightning. The sight of twitching bodies overwhelmed me. Then they froze, leaving nothing more than skeletons. Even the clothes had disappeared. Charred skeletons right there. The shaking had gone right through them, from head to foot, in a kind of harmonious wave. I'll never forget that vision. I left my car near a health centre and followed 2 soldiers and an officer. I forget what his rank was. They had to take me. We covered a good part of the way on foot. It was tiring because it was uphill. This was a real battle, with columns of soldiers advancing on both sides of the road to the airport.
Where the most intense fighting happened was at the blocking position to the east of the airport, where the enemy realized that we enveloped it and that we were set there, and that's when the fighting against tanks as well as Special Republican Guards happened. These Republican Guard had the best equipment that the Iraqi army had.
We went into the airport building. Qusay was there. He was wearing a dish dasher made from khaki wool, 2 cartridge belts, a military jersey, and a keffiyeh around the head. I tried to keep the situation calm, but I could see that he was very agitated. Then I launched into the tale of my detained husband, our home, our children, and how I wanted to save my husband from death. All the while, this officer was running back and forth. Then he leaned over and whispered something into his ear and scribbled something on a piece of paper. Qusay then said, "Come with me and look through the window," right after the officer had had a word with him. This was around 11 o'clock on April the 3rd. A jumbo jet had just landed and everything had calmed down. He said to me, "You are going to see an act of treason. You will be a witness." His words surprised me. I had no idea what he was talking about. Then I saw these metallic-coloured Mercedes drive up to the rear of the plane. They went up the ramp into the hold. The door closed, and the plane immediately took off. I asked him what he meant by treason. He replied, "There is treason in our camp, and you have been a witness. Here is the authorization you need. It is a pardon for your husband." And he stamped it.
The following day, Friday, April 4th at 7 a.m., Hanan Hamid went to the prison of Abu Ghraib, where she secured the release of her husband along with 4 other prisoners. The scene witnessed at the airport would soon resonate with other episodes. The commander of the Republican Guard, responsible for defending Baghdad, had just defected to the Americans in exchange for a few $1 million. For the previous year, he had been a U.S. informant. Now he was finally being airlifted out of Iraq. Meanwhile, another general had deserted. The commander of the Fedayeen of Saddam, the militia led by big cat lover Uday, was also flown to America. The list of the defectors was suddenly growing longer.
After the first week of war, it was known that the director of intelligence, Tahir Jalil al-Habush, had been recruited by the CIA. Later, it was discovered that with the help of some fighters native to Tikrit, the region where Saddam Hussein was born, he had previously collaborated with MI6, the British intelligence services.
We were left to fend for ourselves because there was no more contact between us and our superiors. From the third day of war onwards, the link was cut.
The orders we were given were not proper military orders. We were left to run our own base.
By April 4th, the last Iraqi force had been destroyed, and we could no longer halt the American advance on Baghdad.
Sometimes I used to wonder what the heck they were fighting for, because as I said, I always felt very in control, in command of this tank, and I was looking at them, and there was no way they were going to beat us.
History would remember our failure without offering any explanation, without mentioning our patriotism and courage. That evening, I distanced myself from the other officers and cried like a child that has lost its parents.
April the 4th was a fateful day. The Iraqi army collapsed as Baghdad awaited the fatal blow. Outside the city, Colonels Perkins and Rutter merged their forces, ready to take the city from the south the following day.
Task Force 27 was given the mission in order to leave the airport and then link up with Colonel Dave Perkins's brigade in order to go in on the Thunder Run.
The name of their offensive sounded like the title of a Hollywood adventure movie, Thunder Run. The idea was to launch a fleet of high-speed armored vehicles right across the city, firing relentlessly. It's a tactic that complies with the precept advocated by Tommy Franks, the commander-in-chief of ground forces in Iraq. Speed kills. Only in this case, the enemy was already beaten. Thunder Run would turn out to be a gigantic exercise, some kind of hellish monologue within a real-life situation. No spectators, only victims. On that same April the 4th, Saddam Hussein ended a long silence that had intrigued the whole country. He decided to make a public appearance. Two of his henchmen turned up at the HQ of television channel Al-Iraqia. They ordered cameraman Mohammed Al-Obeidi to accompany them to a Sunni neighborhood of Baghdad known as Al-Adamiyya. As well as Saddam, the cameraman's lens captured the faces of others in the throng. Among them, a zealous bodyguard sporting a striped polo shirt and large glasses. His name was Mohammed Omar Ibrahim al-Muslit. He held only a junior position at this stage. What wasn't known was that this man with the striped polo shirt and large glasses would play a crucial role some months later as the drama of the capture of Saddam Hussein unfolded. The Americans nicknamed him the Fat Guy.
We went with them up to the designated place and were astonished to find Saddam there. When I saw him, I could not believe that it was really Saddam. I thought he had long since left Iraq. He had with him a small group of bodyguards. Some members of the Ba'ath Party came towards him. He began to take children in his arms and embrace them. When he saw the crowd coming, he climbed up onto a car. It was also a way of preventing people from getting too close. He had a highly developed sense of his own safety. He was afraid that the situation might degenerate at any moment. Whenever I raised my camera, for example, he eyed me suspiciously. He was very wary and watched my every move. If you study his movements and his body language, it's obvious that he is ill at ease with regard to the crowd. Throughout the filming, his 4 bodyguards had their hands on their weapons. Watching the footage, they clearly understand that they are through, that the end is nigh. Baghdad was about to fall, and the Americans were very close. When the crowd swelled, he made a sign to his bodyguard wearing glasses. It meant that there were too many people around, that the situation would become uncontrollable if ever they had to escape the crush. The man wearing glasses looked really concerned at that point. When the crowd became even bigger, he decided to leave. He quickly slipped between the people cheering him. It was so quick that the camera couldn't keep up with him. It was as if he just wanted to prove that the people were still with him. He wanted to defy the Americans and show he was still in control.
The president looked like someone else. It wasn't the same Saddam that we had seen before. It wasn't the official dignitary with his entourage around him facing the cameras. He was tense and nervous, pushing the people around him. The editor, myself, and another colleague came to an agreement that from that day on, once we had left the studios, we would never go back. We walked out of there, never to return. And we've never gone back to our jobs.
As planned, the American troops took Baghdad in a pincer movement. They entered the city by the east and by the west. In the vanguard was a battalion of Marines led by Colonel McCoy.
McCoy had a rather uncomplicated psychological profile. He was the son of a Vietnam veteran who loved to play the tough guy with journalists. Kind of, I'm here to do a job, no room for sentiment. War is horrible, people die, it's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it.
The trouble with McCoy's unit, as was the case with a lot of other American units, is that they shot civilians on sight. They didn't necessarily kill people sitting at home on the outskirts. But if anyone got in their way, they wiped them out. They never take risks with their own men.
The rough estimate for McCoy's men, I believe, was 144 fatalities, including 24 or 25 in motor accidents. Over the same 7-month period, the NGO Iraq Body Count, which did its best to maintain a strict record of civilian casualties, reported at least 7,000 civilian deaths in 7 months. Things like that leave their mark.
All Iraqis were surprised by the turn of events. From the beginning, the Americans were perceived as occupying forces.
Paradise Square is in the center of Baghdad. It's where the Palestine and Sheraton hotels are, the 2 places where all the foreign press were staying. The statue there had been erected less than a year before, on April the 28th, 2002, for the head of state's birthday. the most recent of countless statues of Saddam in Iraq. Because Saddam was born in 1937, it has 37 columns, each carrying his initials SH, surrounding this huge statue.
وهي الدبابات والمدرعات كانت محيطة بالساحة ساحة الفردوس.
Tanks and armored vehicles circled the square, and soldiers headed for the statue. We wondered why the American soldiers were there. To bring down the statue or for some other reason. People were wary at first. Then the soldiers took out loudspeakers to announce that the Saddam regime was finished and that they had come to liberate Iraq.
As the crowd got there, it became this big anti-Saddam chant, anti-Saddam thing. It's like, and pretty soon, they were looking at the statue. It's like, got to take down the statue.
I was also realizing our security was being compromised now because lines were completely broken and full of civilians. But there was something about it that we all just kind of knew, just let it happen. Just let this happen. Whatever these people are celebrating, let them do it.
I'd never forget the vision of this guy. Apparently, later on, I found out he was some kind of an Olympic weightlifter or something like this. He's this enormous guy, and he's got a sledgehammer in his hand. But this is an enormous statue. He's not going to come down that way.
McCoy sees all this and is immediately bombarded by all my colleagues holed up in the hotel. They were kind of afraid of looters, so they didn't venture out too often. He gives his interviews to American TV for 30 minutes, and when he comes out, he sees that there are a few more Iraqis around, perhaps 200 to 300. They're trying to knock the statue down without success. So he says to one of his captains, whose name was Louis, help them get that statue down. I don't think McCoy is the type to be disobeyed by his officers, but here Louis pauses and says, "But sir, we're not allowed to destroy statues anymore." Apparently they had destroyed a statue in a frontier village crossing into Iraq from Kuwait. The locals took it badly, saying they were glad to see the back of Saddam, but it was up to them to destroy statues. And here McCoy says to him, "Listen, today's a special day, Louis, so you help them and get that statue down."
An American soldier climbed up and covered the statue's head with an American flag.
I don't know who saw this or how it was seen. I think it might have even been seen by a live feed back in Washington. Somebody in Washington saw this and called the division commander, who called the regimental commander, who called the battalion commander, all in the space of probably about a minute and a half, and said, "Get that flag down." So they got up, they took the American flag down, they put an Iraqi flag up there.
When the crane started to pull, the statue broke loose from its base and broke in two, the legs in one part and the rest in the other. A whole hunk of it fell onto the esplanade and people started to smash it up. The people who had gathered on the square were divided. Those who were delighted with the fall of the statue, and those who wept with disappointment because they could no longer enjoy the privileges of the government in power.
So Brian McCoy became the symbol of the fall of Baghdad. Of course, Baghdad as a whole was taken over 5 or 6 days, but it was April the 9th that the regime fell.
I have a mental image of the fall of the statue. I think that the physical statue fell in Paradise Square, but the one that we carry within us is still standing.
When the Americans arrived, we hid. It was a Thursday. We didn't know what was going to happen to us with no electricity, in the middle of the night. Only the faucets worked. The water was cold because it was the middle of winter. We went out and saw the Americans, but we had no contact with them. They didn't speak to us.
The first time I saw the Americans was in Abu Ghraib, while I was walking towards Baghdad. They had occupied a school in the Risala neighborhood. They were sitting around a fire, laughing. They had taken control of Baghdad. The Iraqi army had vanished, and there was no more resistance. We walked along holding a piece of white cloth to show that we were no longer in the army. We knocked on the door of a house to ask for some drinking water. We told them we were soldiers returning from the front on foot, and we were thirsty. But they threatened to turn us over to the Americans. Go away. You are thieves. They spoke to us from the roof of their home. They wouldn't open the door. All we could see were people entering public buildings to loot them and set fire to them. When it was announced on April 9th that Iraq was occupied, I was near the Iraqi army base. So, driven by feelings of patriotism, I went along with some other people to find weapons and prepare for the battle after occupation.
What surprised me most was the administrative buildings and the Baghdad Museum were left unprotected, while an Abrams tank was guarding the Ministry of Oil.
Back up, back up, back up!
We approached an American soldier near the museum. I was with Dr. Benham Abu al-Suf, a historian and Iraqi archaeologist. We pleaded with them to protect the museum, but they didn't do anything. That was when I realized that it wasn't just Saddam Hussein. The whole long history of Baghdad was being obliterated.
I arrived in Baghdad for the first time on an American C-130 plane. I was with a whole group of Iraqis. Without really thinking about it, I expected to go through passport control and have my passport stamped. But all I found there were Marines. American Marines in Baghdad airport. I asked myself, what are these people doing here in Baghdad?
Two days before Saddam's statue fell, the Iraqis were all approached by the military logistics team, and they put out a map on the table of Baghdad, and they said, where should we house all these thousands of Americans? I couldn't believe it. I said, you mean you have nowhere yet? You haven't planned it? And he said, no. And I said, look, you cannot go anywhere there. Unfortunately, I was the one who said, the only place you can go, and I circled the green zone.
The Green Zone was this enclave in the center of Baghdad that originally was used by Saddam Hussein for his main palace, the Republican Palace, a number of other official buildings. Because it had walls, it was easy to defend. All the Americans initially had to do was park some tanks at each of the main roads leading into it, and early on that was good enough. The term Green Zone was coined by some of the American security personnel to identify it as the safe area. And the only Iraqis who really went into the Green Zone were those who worked for the Americans, and they called the rest of Baghdad the Red Zone.
Of course, the first question when I arrived in Baghdad was where I should go. My home had been confiscated by Saddam Hussein and given to someone else. Where could I go? My friends were not there anymore. They had all been executed, killed, or tortured. So I headed for the presidential palace and arrived there before General Garner.
General J. Garner arrived in Baghdad just a few days after the fall of the city. The situation was urgent, and he had been handed a thankless task for which Washington had failed to make adequate preparations: the management of the shambles that was post-war Iraq. J. Garner was a quiet man and a reassuring presence. Indeed, part of his brief was to bring an air of confidence to the process of liberating Iraq. The serious business could be dealt with later. In Baghdad, the general moved into what remained of the Republican Palace, in the heart of the Green Zone.
It was a mess. There was no running water, there was no electricity. So the first thing we had to do is get all that cleaned out and get everybody established, get some electricity in there so their computers would work and we could go to work. That took 3 or 4 days.
We slept in sleeping bags on the floor in the palace. We stayed there for several weeks. Baghdad had changed a lot.
In the halls of the palace, J. Garner became the leader of a hastily built organization with objectives that no one else seemed to believe possible.
It was designed or built to do 3 things. Number one, to handle any humanitarian crisis that might result as a function of the war. Number two, to begin reconstruction, to reconstruct those things that needed to be built, those things that were destroyed. And number 3, to bring the government back and start a government process.
J. Garner had barely settled into his crumbling palace when back in Washington, President Bush and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld were already planning his successor. They wanted a firm hand and a good executive.
Our country will be sending one of our best citizens. He's a man.
His name was Paul Bremer, or to be precise, Louis Paul Bremer III, almost a monarch's name. And in Iraq, he was to have the power of a viceroy. Always dressed up to the nines, he was a tireless worker with a meticulous eye for detail. Henry Kissinger, who had worked alongside Bremer, described him as a control freak. His wife, Frances, was very proud of him. She even wrote a book, Coping with His Success, a survival guide for wives. She clearly remembers the moment when the White House confirmed his appointment in Iraq. They took each other's hand and prayed together.
And that's something that we will be willing to discuss at the appropriate time.
Thank you, everybody.
That evening, I got a phone call from Secretary Rumsfeld, said, just want to check in with you, tell you everything you're doing is great, we like what you're doing. And by the way, the president has picked the envoy. He wants to run Iraq, and that would be former Ambassador Jerry Bremer. And I'd like to have you call him tomorrow and talk. And the next morning when I was coming downstairs about 6 o'clock in the morning, I was going to call Ambassador Bremer. The phone was ringing, I picked it up, it was Ambassador Bremer calling me. So that's the first conversation I had with him, and that was my second day in Iraq. As we began to get things where we could go to work, we found that none of the government agencies had come back to work. They had all just gone home. So we literally put our people on the streets of Baghdad, walking around the streets saying, do you know anybody that was in the Ministry of Electricity? Do you know anybody that was in the Ministry of Education, etc.?
Our first idea was to constitute a new Iraqi government in collaboration with the Americans. But that didn't work out, because the Americans favored the returning Iraqi exiles.
Among the American baggage was a face that had not been seen for many a year, Ahmed Shalabi, a man it was hard to take seriously. Of all the returning Iraqis in exile, he was the White House's choice to lead the new Iraq.
I am America's best friend in Iraq.
The scenario was a perfect match for his ambitions. Ahmed Shalabi looked a decent sort, but his CV raised a few doubts. Founded a Shiite movement of Iraqi opponents in exile that was broadly supported by the CIA and yet maintained close ties with the Iranian secret services. Sentenced to 22 years in prison in absentia by the Jordanian government for the misappropriation of $70 million. Fabricated evidence of the existence of weapons of mass destruction to justify the invasion of Iraq. Led a strong-arm militia that had actively plundered government ministries. Implicated in the forgery of banknotes during the introduction of the new Iraqi currency, as well as a host of other dubious activities. Back in Iraq, Ahmed Shalabi had but one objective: to be the Americans' main man and to become the country's new leader.
I met Shalabi on the 14th of April when I went to Nasiriyah. He and I did not like each other from the moment we met. And he left after we had the discussion, and he kind of told me, I'm going to Baghdad, I'm going to run things. I told him, no, you're not going to run, you're not going to do that. I'm going to Baghdad, and I'll decide who runs things. And so we didn't even shake hands when he left.
Paul Bremer, nicknamed Jerry, landed in Baghdad on May the 12th, 2003. For the time being, he too would have to settle for a folding bed on the first floor of the Republican Palace. Every morning, he would invariably rise at 5 a.m., embark on a 5-kilometer jog through the green zone, then sit down to work at 6:30. Every Sunday, he would attend Mass in the chapel set up in the middle of the palace hall. On the walls was a fresco glorifying the Iraqi army's Scud missiles. But Jerry was only interested in one thing: purging Iraq of its old demons and setting the country on the rails to modern democracy. He had to face the task alone, but he was a man who liked to make decisions single-handedly.
Ambassador Bremer was a veteran American diplomat. He was a polished guy, but his trademark was to wear a pair of tan combat boots with his suits wherever he went. It was a little unusual. You walk into his office, you see this man in a suit, but with desert boots.
Jerry was particularly fond of his celebrated boots. His son had given them to him before his departure for Baghdad. Accompanying the gift was a card bearing the words, "Kick ass, Dad."
Bremer was a strong personality and a real authoritarian. During the first meeting of the Government Council, I asked him what his remit was and what his responsibilities were. He said sarcastically, "My remit is that of an occupier. I have got all the powers Saddam Hussein had, along with any more I might consider necessary." He wielded absolute power.
Within a few days of his arrival, Bremer would create a veritable infernal machine, a hitherto unseen production line of insurgents. He announced 3 decisions that would trigger a long and destructive seismic shift. Firstly, Ba'ath and Ba'athists were to be eradicated from Iraqi society.
If you said the word Ba'athist to many in Washington, they heard Nazi.
Ahmed Shalabi, to his great satisfaction, would be responsible for the purge.
For a decade, they didn't have interaction with real Iraqis from Iraq. They would interact with these external opposition groups who were shaping their message to the Americans and telling them things that they wanted to hear.
Secondly, the Iraqi army was disbanded, pure and simple.
What we did within 24 hours, we told 50,000 Ba'athists they were out of jobs, and we told 400,000 soldiers they were out of jobs. And 2 days later, the first IED went off.
Thirdly, a free market economy was instigated after several decades of state control. The old state-owned factories were either sold off or shut down.
By failing to reopen those factories, even if it wasn't the most efficient thing in the world to do, it led a lot of those people to go and join the insurgency. You took away their livelihood. They didn't know whether they'd be able to pay for their families to get food on the table. So they decided instead to fight the Americans.
To me, when those decisions took place, the de-Baathification, the disbanding of the army, and the disbanding of the interim government, the group we put together, all that happened within 3 days. And that period took us from being liberators to being occupiers.
The Iraqi people reacted differently depending on who they were and where they were. Shia, as I mentioned, were thrilled, at least initially. The Kurds were very happy. The Sunni, it depended. Most of them lost. When the regime fell, the Ba'ath Party was disestablished. Their status in life, their income dropped. The most unhappy were, of course, the military.
Certain young people, regardless of their identity or who they belong to, began to form the core of the resistance. Some of them have their group names, such as Mohammed's Army. We didn't support any party. We didn't take orders from anyone. In some regions, you had a group of ex-army officers. In others, you had civilians. You even had people who had no experience of handling weapons at all. Others were deserters from the Iraqi army who had no particular attachment toward the army or their homeland. Their patriotism was fired by the occupation.
During this period, American intelligence had no real presence in Iraq. Lacking information, they resorted to building a communications network that turned the tracking of fugitives into a game of luck and money. Every head had its price. The highest reward, $25 million, was offered for the capture of Saddam Hussein, public enemy number one. To that end, the Americans secretly gave a free hand to those who were all too aware that Saddam had been their executioner, the Kurds.
I was selling ice cream during the day to meet the needs of my family. Then I would be fighting at night.
I had been in military administration, so I didn't know how to handle weapons. And the people who joined us couldn't handle weapons either. We Iraqis didn't know anything about guerrilla warfare. The weapons used in guerrilla warfare aren't the same as conventional army weapons.
I personally repaired and rehabilitated weapons and trained fighters how to use guns such as RPGs and PKCs.
We ran into a lot of difficulties. We didn't know, for example, how to use rocket launchers. We were determined to learn. As soon as operations against the Americans began in earnest, people became increasingly bold.
وأول عمل قمت به هنا براس شارع أنا ومجموعتي.
I did my first operation here at the end of the street with my group. Our expert prepared an explosive device. He hid it in a hole while a team from the group went out and covered it. We watched out for a passing American patrol. The bomb exploded when the armored vehicle ran over the device. Then we slipped away, satisfied with our action.
It was a very typical guerrilla war, a shadow army fighting us from the darkness, from the desert, away from the urban area, and they would come in, be sheltered by the local people who supported the insurgency, who would not tell us who it was who was conducting these attacks. Was very much what Lawrence of Arabia described as fighting a war against a vapor or against a ghost, something you really can't put your hands around, you can't grab a hold of it and tie it down.
During the first acts of resistance, we didn't hide. We didn't wear balaclavas. The streets were with us. When we returned from an attack against the Americans, people embraced us warmly. The women cheered us on, having seen the mistakes the USA made.
Very few of us had any understanding of counterinsurgency. We had voided all knowledge of that after Vietnam. And so we went through a very painful process of learning by doing, making very painful mistakes that in some cases cost lives.
We developed strategies to fight these insurgents with the art of the ambush, with setting out an elaborate network of observation posts secretly, with sniping teams, with the laying of patrols, all in a network, and the tactics were quite effective.
The case of the French in Algiers is an enormously instructive one, I think. The Battle of Algiers, the movie, was actually shown at the Pentagon in 2003 as the insurgency in Iraq was getting started, to try to help the decision makers in the Pentagon understand what kind of war it was that was now being fought. Intelligence becomes far and away the most important part of the fight. The tank battalion I was a part of had only 4 intelligence personnel assigned to it, and there were 800 other fighters and mechanics and cooks assigned to the organization. But I often said that I would have been better off if I'd had 800 intelligence officers and only 4 fighters.
Intelligence services began appearing within the resistance. They were collecting information on the American troops, their movements, their locations, etc. Each faction had its own internal organization.
I think ironically that there were not very many radical Islamists in Iraq prior to the American invasion in March of 2003, but the presence of Americans inside Iraq in large numbers after the occupation began, drew Al-Qaeda in Iraq into the country and really led to the formation of AQI. And it was immensely frustrating and extraordinarily difficult, and the most difficult thing I had ever done in my life.
A candy-colored clown they call the Sandman tiptoes to my room every night just to sprinkle stardust and to whisper, go to sleep, everything is all right. I close my eyes.
I arrived at Baghdad International Airport on 23rd of July, 2003. It was the same day that they had just killed Uday and Qusay, Saddam's two sons. Physically, what I felt when I got off the plane, it was pitch dark, and I felt like I was walking into an oven. Well, I showed up at the Baghdad International Airport, and I was assigned to a task force that was responsible for tracking down all the high-value targets in Iraq. They had different teams located throughout Iraq. So after 4 or 5 days, they told me that they needed a guy to go to Tikrit for 48 hours. So I jumped on a helicopter, and I went to Tikrit for 48 hours, and it ended up being over 4 months.
I remember when I got to Tikrit in May, you could tell that we were not welcome in that town. They hated us. Killer glances where they would stare at you, spit as you went by, even from women. It was not a welcoming place. Not surprising. Tikrit was a Ba'athist town. It was a government town, and its only notoriety was the fact that Saddam was from there. Saddam had a network that we were able to learn about early on after we occupied the city of Tikrit. After learning about who they were, we also learned that these families supplied his closest bodyguards, that he had organizations.
Working with the task force, we started going after these social networks of individuals who weren't really on the run, but had the same information, could provide the locations and the daily activities of these wanted individuals. That's initially how I felt like we started to get on the right track to finding Saddam.
And it centered really around 5 controlling families, 2 other supporting families.
I'd identified 4 bodyguards, 3 brothers and a cousin.
And the most important of those families were the Muslit family.
One of the bodyguards was Muhammad Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit. From December 1st to December 13th, the task force, we did approximately 9 raids to capture other relatives and associates of Muhammad Ibrahim. And at 2 o'clock in the morning on December 13th, we captured Muhammad Ibrahim.
During the fall of Baghdad, Lieutenant Colonel Mohammed Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit was one of the faithful who accompanied and protected Saddam while he escaped. During the 7 months that Saddam had been in hiding, he had become his most trusted lieutenant, his messenger to a group of insurgents. Al-Muslit was not a card in the American pack, yet he knew where the ace of spades was hidden. It was just a matter of making him talk.
I began my interrogations of him at 5 o'clock in the morning, and when I initially talked to him, he said, "I don't know who Saddam Hussein is." The primary technique, the most effective technique that I've discovered, and it's not just in Iraq in 2003, but for the 2,700 interrogations that I've done, is that I need to get a prisoner, I need to keep him close to his hometown. I need to give him that sense that he's one door away from going home. So I need to give him that hope. Of course, the most effective techniques are not physical torture. That's the opposite of what I do. I'm not gonna touch you, buddy. I'm not gonna lay a finger on you. With every one of my prisoners, my philosophy to get them to cooperate with me is I try to provide them the absolute worst case scenario and the absolute best case scenario. The best case scenario is they go home and the United States military is no longer looking for them or any member of their family. The worst case scenario, they're going to stay in prison and I'm going to raid and capture the households of every single friend, family in their world.
Many of these guys, when they were finally captured after being on the run for so long, like the fugitive who was caught almost relieved, and they would cooperate with authorities, same way. So Muslit, he begins to cooperate.
And I explained to him, Muhammad Ibrahim, it's me and my team. We've captured 40 of your relatives. They're with us now. And I listed off memory 30 more relatives of his, and then started telling him, and they live here, and they live here. They're in this house. Now you can take me to Saddam, or I'm gonna keep going after him. I'm gonna go after every relative you've ever known, because maybe they'll take me. Took him about 15 more minutes to think of it, debate it, and then he realized, we gotta go. See, when he gets captured, when Saddam finds out Saddam's gonna move, Muhammad Ibrahim now decided he wants to take us to Saddam, and he realized we gotta do it quick. So he said, let's go, let's go.
And so as a result of that, they took Muslit and they did a reconnaissance, trying to get him to point out the general area where he could be. And this was done very secretively.
In dreams I walk with you. In dreams I talk.
The story might have finished here with a perfect ending.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
But in Iraq, nothing is simple or perfect. In the pursuit and capture of Saddam Hussein, there was a third man who was playing a key role behind the scenes. Without him, none of this would have been possible. A Kurdish warlord, one of the main underground leaders of Peshmergas and fiercely opposed to Saddam, he is still revered by his men. His name is Khosrat Rasul Ali. He chose this moment to emerge from the shadows and break his silence, by way of saying that without a guide or a tracker, no manhunt would succeed in finding its prey. Unlike the American intelligence services, Khosrat Rasul's men had long since infiltrated the workings of the Ba'athist regime. They knew all its weaknesses and networks.
I can confirm that we had informants in the Presidential Guard, the Adnan Secret Services, the Hammurabi Army Corps, the Ba'athist Command and Army, the government. We had reliable information from many sources. In the Tikrit region, we had a lot of agents. The Arab tribes helped us. The Ubaid, Jabur, and Azza tribes helped us find the guards who spent time with Saddam. Saddam was hiding in the countryside to the northwest of Tikrit, near Dora. The property belonged to a member of his family. He was living in 2 rooms there. 4 or 5 brothers acted as Saddam's special guards. They were from the Al-Baghdad tribe, Saddam's tribe. This tribe lives in Beji in the village of Al-Awajah. These men all came from Al-Awajah. They collaborated with us and gave us information. We knew where he was hiding, who was providing food, who was helping him when he came out of his hiding place, and who had contact with him. We gave all this information to the Americans. They added it to what they already knew and went on to arrest him. Without our information, they would have been powerless to act.
No, it's a complete fabrication.
The Americans came to thank us. We had been promised a reward. Not only did they not give us anything, they ended up claiming all the credit for themselves. They denied any involvement from us in his capture.
We have seen so many supposed theories about what actually happened. That a Lebanese descent U.S. Marine was involved and got nonsense. Absolute nonsense. That the Kurds had actually captured him sometime before and held him. Absolute fabrication.
Perhaps Colonel Russell is so skeptical about the role of the Kurds because he was doubtless totally unaware of the existence of Khosrat Rasul. When it came to passing on the decisive information he had gathered, the Kurdish leader was smart enough to deal only with the very highest level of American command in the Tikrit region, General Ray Odierno himself and his assistant, Michael Barbero.
Saddam Hussein was captured Saturday, December 13th at about...
Both parties benefited from the outcome. The Americans reveled in the plaudits from the media, while behind the scenes the Kurds, who had contributed from the very start to the overthrow of Saddam, were given guarantees of a role in the new Iraq. It was a good deal all round for them, solid but low-key, with the advantage of leaving all the glory and fuss to those who wanted it most. There probably remained a few photographs that Colonel Russell had never seen and that nobody would pay much attention to. Saddam Hussein was captured on December the 13th, 2003. In the course of this year of thunder and fire, none of our main protagonists could have guessed what would happen to them. Saddam Hussein did not know that he would be hanged 3 years later, one winter morning at dawn. Muwaffaq al-Rubai did not know that one day soon he would attend this execution in person, or that he would keep a souvenir in his office of Saddam's hanging rope, which he would show off to us with a smile. Saad did not know that his companion Amina, too smitten with her freedom, would, like many others, be targeted and would fall under a hail of gunfire on her birthday in 2006, the year that Baghdad stumbled into a state of turmoil.
When the Americans entered Baghdad, we dreamed that many things would come to pass. But then Iraqis found themselves faced with a series of concrete blocks. It turns out that there are more blocks than people. The Iraqi street has lost its diversity.
Amina knew that she could never be stopped from thinking or speaking out. Saad knew that he would carry on writing. Mohammed Sadek did not know that he would ask his young son to dig holes in the garden to hide weapons in, and that one accursed afternoon he and some of his comrades would be subjected to the unforgiving strafing of a Black Hawk helicopter. General Hamdani did not know that he would end the war alone, hidden on a peasant farm, that he would turn himself over to the victors, and that he in turn would be forced to live in exile far from Baghdad. Hanan Hamid did not know that all her efforts to save her husband under the bombing and the fury would only serve to postpone his death for a while longer. Eric Maddox did not know that he would become the hero of a fictional film that would have as its title, Mission Blacklist. Steve Russell did not know that he would become a Republican senator for Oklahoma, and that his seminars proclaiming his achievements in Iraq would prove to be a huge draw. McCoy did not know that after Baghdad, Kabul would be next, and that when it comes down to it, a sense of mystery, like on the dark side, is better than condemnation. Ali Khosrat Rasool did not know that many years of war and wounds take their toll, and that his health would decline just as peace finally returned around him. Sami Hilali, our driver who saw everything, but who never appeared on film until the day he walked around the car we were in, did not know that one evening, after so much violence and distress, he would look us straight in the eye and utter a few words in French, learned by heart, like a cry for help or a message of hope. I love Victor Hugo. I love Albert Camus.
السلطة الدكتاتورية أعادت إنتاج نفسها.
The old dictatorship has produced new dictators under different forms. My dream of a secular state has gone up in smoke. Because the worst form of absolutism is religious absolutism. But I'm reluctant to voice my despair. It's true that in Saddam's day there was security, but no hope. While now, even though the feeling of security is gone, at least there is hope.